cabinet that I'm building here is for my office, and it has space on top for my printer on this rollout shelf. And beneath that are 2 drawers made for files. And at the bottom there are 2 more drawers for various other things. Much of what you see on the outside is made from 3/4 inch maple plywood. And the first thing I need to do is break the full sheet down into smaller pieces. And I'm just going to be using a skill saw and my straight edge guide to do that. These strips of plywood underneath the sheet are there to keep me from cutting into my workbench when I'm making the cuts. Just going to reposition those when I pull the sheet ahead so I can make another cut. Now that I've got parts that are easier to handle, I can finish the cutting on the table saw. In particular, the top and bottom panel, which I'm going to cut from this larger piece. Next, I need to make some dados in the side panels, and I'm setting up my straight edge guide again to do that. Now the plywood I'm using for the shelves is not quite a 1/2 inch thick, and I don't have a router bit that matches it, so I'm going to do it in 2 passes, and instead of moving the straight edge guide, I've cut a thin strip that'll space the router over just enough to make the dado the right width. The way I'm building this cabinet is a little bit unusual. I've cut pieces of solid maple that are the same thickness as the plywood, and those will be the corners of the cabinet. So I'm going to fasten them first to the top and bottom panel. For the first panel, I'm using a couple of my homemade bar clamps. But then for the second one, I remembered the clamps that I keep forgetting. These are edge banding clamps that I made several years ago, and they're perfect for this type of thing right here. While the glue is drying on those, I've got one more dado to cut in the side panels. This is a slot that goes across the top, and this is for the rollers on that upper door that swings up. And I'm sure there's proper hardware that you can get for this, but I like to improvise using the stuff that I've already got. So I'm going to take the rollers from these old drawer slides that I salvaged from my old kitchen. In the meantime, the glue dried on the top and bottom panels, I can go ahead and get those fastened, and I'm going to be doing it in the same way with glue and biscuits. The only difference this time is that I'm going to be using construction adhesive for the glue. And what this does, it gives me a lot more time to work with and make sure that the parts are lined up correctly. It also gives me plenty of time to check to make sure that the cabinet is square. And to do that, I'm measuring from corner to corner. If the measurements are the same, the cabinet is square. Because it takes a long time for that glue to set, I let it dry overnight. But in the meantime, I cut the shelves that will go in the middle, and now I'm getting ready to put them in. Once again, I'm using construction adhesive for this, just pumping it into the dado and spreading the sides out a little bit with a stick that I cut and sliding the shelf in. A little bit got pushed out of the ends, of course, but more than enough stayed in the joint to make a strong bond. The glue is all you need to hold the panel in, but I'm going to fire in a couple of pins just to keep it from moving around. On the next shelf up, I sanded the front corners a little bit, and my thinking here was that maybe it wouldn't push out so much glue. And I'm sure it helped, a little bit anyway. Next, I can get the back panel put in for this section. I'm not going to be using any glue here though. I'm just going to drive in a bunch of 1 1/4 inch brads. This section is for the file drawers, and there are 2 of those, so I need to put a divider in the middle. And the divider needs to be spaced equally from each side. And I find the best way to do that is to cut strips of wood to the right length and jam them in there. With that done, the basic structure of the cabinet is assembled. And what I'm doing here is I'm edge banding the front of the cabinet. And where the veneer tape meets at the corner, I want to miter that. I've got one side lapped over the other, and I'm cutting through both layers with the sharp knife. I finished the edge banding and I trimmed it all flush, and now I need to sand the cabinet, but I have to be careful here that I don't sand through the thin veneer on the plywood. With that much done, I figured it was a good idea to bring it outdoors and get some finish on it. I'm using water-based polyurethane, and I'm spraying on 3 coats, sanding in between each coat. Once again, I'm making use of these salvage slides, but the ones that I have are a little bit too long, so I'm going to cut them to length just by trimming off the end that doesn't have the roller. few years ago, I came up with a way to mount these so that you can't see them when you open the drawer. And I thought I would do that here, mainly because it's kind of an interesting technique. So what I'm making here is the part that actually goes inside the cabinet, that one part of the drawer slide mounts on. And then I can move on to building the drawers themselves, and mainly what I'm using here are offcuts and scraps of plywood left over from other projects. I find it's always a good idea to try to use up that stuff whenever possible, so I always look through what I have while I'm building a project like this. I want to use kind of an interesting method to join the sides to the front and back panel, and that's to cut a very small tongue and groove joint between the parts that's just the thickness of a single saw cut. I've used this method a few other times, and mainly what it does is it helps to keep the parts lined up. It also adds a little bit of strength to the joint to keep it from pulling apart. I need a rail at the top of the drawers that will engage the hanging folders, and I'm going to cut that from more scrap, except this time it's solid maple from an old cabinet that I took apart a few years ago. It's handy that the pieces that I cut out of the rail to make the rabbet fit on the ends to cap the plywood. I didn't record putting in the first drawer because that's usually where you make all your mistakes and take the longest to do it. But I will show putting the second one in and how it all works. To help line up the parts, I cut strips of plywood to the right width and use those to mark the locations. Those strips that I made that I attached one half of the drawer slide to get screwed down on the inside of the cabinet. The doors and drawer fronts on this cabinet are inset, so everything has to be spaced in from the front by 3/4 of an inch, and I'm using a small block of plywood to do that. This method of installing the drawer slides is a trade-off. You don't see them when you open the drawer, but they take up more space underneath. However, you can make the drawer wider than you normally would as well. So that might be a big advantage right there. There's not a whole lot to the two bottom drawers, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here with this video. I've covered this construction method for this type of drawer before, and there's a link in the description if you want to go and check out a more detailed video on that. These are just basically boxes made from 1/2-inch plywood. No fancy joinery, just butt joints that are glued and nailed. But I did take the time to reinforce the front corners using a method that I came up with a few years ago. I guess you could call these floating dovetails or dovetail splines, and I'm using a simple jig that I made to cut the slots. And then the dovetail itself is a separate piece of wood that I cut, and that gets glued and driven in and works exactly the same way as a traditional dovetail. As you saw in the opening, the top compartment on this cabinet has a tray that slides out, and to make that I'm squaring off a scrap of Baltic birch plywood to use as the bottom, and I'm using the better plywood because it's stiffer and it won't sag as much as the cheaper stuff will. And for the edges on the side, I'm using solid maple again. You really only need these to fasten the drawer slide to, so they don't have to be anything special. I can remove these rubber bumpers at the back of the drawer slide for the tray because they kind of lock it in position when it's closed and make it more difficult to slide out. Next, I can get started on working on the base, And for that, I'm going to be using solid maple for maximum durability. The base does take a lot of abuse, either from moving it around or just getting knocked into. And I'm working with rough lumber here, so there's a lot of processing I need to do, like flattening one face on my homemade jointer before sending it through the planer. And then cutting it to finish width, and I've also got a detail at the top corner. It's called a reveal. I'm going to cut that on the table saw. And to get rid of the saw cuts, I'm going to use a sharp chisel as a scraper. To assemble the base, I'm using strong tape on the miter joints and then putting in plenty of glue. And then I don't rely on the strength of the miter itself. I'm going to add some glue blocks in the corners as well. And these will also allow me to easily attach the base to the bottom of the cabinet. This is a modern looking cabinet with lots of straight lines and square corners, but I wanted to add something that would counterbalance that and also give it a little bit more visual appeal or interest. And I thought I could do that with the handles. These are basically a more elegant version of the type I've used in many shop projects. Made from solid wood, I'm using maple here again. These run the full width and are fastened to the top of the drawer front or door. And will have a compound curve that hopefully will give me what I'm looking for. With all of the tricky stuff done, the last things to make are the doors and drawer fronts, and I reserved a piece of the 3/4 inch plywood to cut these from. Cutting them all from a single piece like this is a good idea. It makes it so that the grain and color on all of the doors and drawer fronts match up. And here you can see how the handles that I made get fastened. I'm just using glue and firing in some pin nails to hold it in place while the glue sets. To fasten the drawer fronts, I'm using double-sided tape to temporarily hold it on. And then I can carefully pull it open and get some clamps on there before driving some screws from the inside. For the 2 file drawers, I decided to make one full-length pull and then cut it in half and notch the end so that it would work with each drawer. The upper door that swings up has rollers on each end, and to help install those, I made a drilling guide from plywood, and this will help to locate the rollers in exactly the same place on both sides. With all of the basic assembly done, I'm going to sand all of the parts that aren't finished yet, and then bring them out and spray on 3 coats of water-based polyurethane.